In the neatly maintained neighborhood of Crestwood Meadows, everything appeared perfectly ordinary on the surface. The manicured lawns, the tidy hedges, and the rows of identical mailboxes gave the impression of harmony. But beneath that surface, tensions often simmered. It was a community ruled not by kindness or understanding, but by rules, regulations, and the ever-watchful eyes of the Homeowners Association. Among those eyes, none were more piercing or more intrusive than those of the woman everyone whispered about, the self-proclaimed enforcer, better known as the neighborhood Karen. The incident began innocently enough. A black Jeep, sturdy and slightly out of place among the gleaming SUVs and carefully polished sedans, sat parked in the driveway of one of the homes near the entrance of the subdivision. To most, it was simply a vehicle, functional, parked within the rules, and unworthy of special attention. But to Karen, it was a violation, or at least something she convinced herself didn't belong. The Jeep had a hardened look, with reinforced bumpers and a lock securing one of its compartments, something unusual for the quiet suburban streets. To her, its presence was an invitation for confrontation. Karen had a reputation for nitpicking every detail of the community. She was the type to measure grass length with a ruler, to send warning letters if a trash can lingered too long at the curb, or to berate children for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. To her, the HOA was not just an organization, but a weapon, an excuse to control, correct, and command. And when she spotted the Jeep, her sense of power swelled. She told herself she was protecting the neighborhood, but in truth, she thrived on conflict. The homeowner who parked the Jeep had chosen Crestwood Meadows precisely because it was quiet. He wasn't the type to chat at block parties or share coffee over fences. He valued discretion, privacy, and the ability to blend in. What no one knew was that he was not an ordinary resident. The Jeep, though appearing like a regular vehicle to most, was part of an undercover police task force. Fleet. It wasn't marked with official insignia, but its reinforced features and secured lock made it more than just a personal car. It carried equipment, sensitive files, and occasionally even evidence. Its presence in the driveway was deliberate and necessary, but only he understood its importance. Karen, however, didn't see a police vehicle. She saw what she considered an eyesore. To her, the lock on the Jeep's rear compartment suggested suspicious behavior. Her imagination ran wild, weaving stories about rule-breaking neighbors hiding contraband, conducting illegal business, or tarnishing the pristine image of Crestwood Meadows. She never once paused to consider she might be out of line. In her mind, she was the law when the HOA wasn't watching. For several days, Karen observed the Jeep from her front window. She scribbled notes, timing when it arrived and when it left, tracking how long it sat in the driveway. Each time she saw the glint of the secured lock, her determination deepened. She called fellow HOA board members, leaving exaggerated voicemails about unauthorized vehicles and potential dangers to the neighborhood. But impatience was Karen's defining trait. When no one responded quickly enough, she decided to take matters into her own hands. On a warm afternoon, armed with bolt cutters she had borrowed from her garage, Karen marched across the street. Her expression was set, her steps brisk, her mission clear. She muttered about community safety as she approached the Jeep, glancing left and right to make sure no one was watching too closely. In her mind, she was a hero, preventing disaster. In reality, she was seconds away from creating chaos. The lock on the Jeep's compartment was thick, designed for durability and security, but Karen's determination was thicker. She positioned the cutters and struggled at first, her arms straining against the resistance. It took several attempts, grunts, and moments of frustration, but finally, with one sharp snap, the lock gave way. The sound echoed louder than she expected, and for a moment she froze, her heart racing. But then, emboldened by her small victory, she pulled the compartment open. What she found inside was not what she expected. Instead of hidden contraband or careless clutter, there were neatly arranged tactical bags, communication equipment, and gear that clearly did not belong to an ordinary civilian. Karen's eyes scanned the contents, but she lacked the knowledge to recognize their significance. All she saw were items she deemed suspicious, and she felt justified in taking action. She began rummaging, convinced she would find proof of wrongdoing. What Karen didn't realize was that a small motion sensor inside the compartment had already alerted the Jeep's owner. The silent notification reached his phone instantly, informing him of unauthorized access. At that moment, he was several miles away, but his training kicked in. He knew that sensitive equipment could not fall into the wrong hands, even if those hands belonged to a nosy neighbor with too much time. He turned his vehicle around, heading straight back toward Crestwood Meadows. Meanwhile, Karen continued her invasive inspection, her sense of triumph growing by the minute. She told herself the HOA would thank her for uncovering such evidence. She imagined standing at the next board meeting, arms crossed, as everyone applauded her for catching a supposed violator. She didn't stop to question why such equipment would be left unsecured in the first place, nor did she consider that tampering with someone else's property might carry consequences. Her certainty blinded her. As she closed the compartment, leaving the broken lock hanging uselessly, she stepped back to admire what she thought was her good deed. The Jeep, however, stood silently as though holding its breath. Its true purpose, its hidden connection to law enforcement, remained unspoken, but events were already in motion that would soon reveal everything. Karen strutted back to her house, bolt cutters in hand, rehearsing the story she would later share. To her, it was a simple matter of neighborhood pride, of keeping things tidy and compliant. But to the man racing back to the subdivision, it was a violation not just of property, but of security. And as the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across Crestwood Meadows, two very different interpretations of justice were on a collision course. This was only the beginning. The quiet rhythm of Crestwood Meadows rarely changed. Afternoons were marked by joggers pacing along sidewalks, sprinklers arcing water over trimmed lawns, and the occasional murmur of conversations drifting across driveways. But on this particular evening, a storm was silently brewing. The Jeep's owner, known only to his neighbors as a reserved man who kept to himself, was driving back faster than he ever intended, his phone pulsing with the silent alarm that told him someone had tampered with his vehicle. Every second felt weighted with urgency because he knew what rested inside that Jeep was not only valuable, but classified. It wasn't just his personal property that had been violated. It was evidence tied to active investigations. Back in the neighborhood, Karen had settled into her living room, sipping a self-satisfied cup of tea while glancing occasionally out the window. Her bolt cutters leaned against the wall, a quiet symbol of her so-called victory. She had no idea what she had triggered. To her, she had struck a blow against disorder, ensuring Crestwood Meadows maintained its spotless reputation. She imagined herself at the next HOA meeting, praised for her boldness, perhaps even nominated for a leadership role. She replayed, the sound of the snapping lock in her mind like a triumphant anthem. Meanwhile, as the Jeep's owner neared the subdivision, his thoughts raced. He wasn't just a task force member by title. He lived by rules forged in discipline. The Jeep was more than a mode of transportation. Its compartments carried surveillance data, tactical gear, and items linked to ongoing cases that couldn't afford exposure. He knew the alarm was precise, meaning someone had not only approached, but breached the secured compartment. His worst fear wasn't just theft. It was compromise. The thought that sensitive equipment might be scattered across a suburban street because of a neighbor's ignorance filled him with equal parts anger and dread. He turned into Crestwood Meadows, his tires rolling over the cobblestones at the entrance. Everything looked deceptively calm, the fluttering flags on porches, the soft glow of evening lights, the children pedaling bikes along the cul-de-sac. But then his eyes locked on the Jeep. Even from a distance, he saw the compartment slightly ajar, the lock dangling uselessly from its latch. His pulse quickened. Parking swiftly, he stepped out and approached the vehicle, scanning for immediate threats. The equipment appeared untouched, though rummaged. He secured what he could in seconds, muscle memory guiding his hands. His instincts told him this wasn't random vandalism. Whoever had done this hadn't fled in haste, but had lingered, prying into things that weren't theirs. He glanced across the street and noticed movement, curtains shifting slightly in a window. A pair of watchful eyes lingered longer than they should have, before darting back behind fabric. He didn't need confirmation. He had lived quietly among his neighbors long enough to know who carried a reputation for meddling. Karen's constant. Surveillance of the street had been the subject of whispers, her confrontations legendary in the HOA's history. His jaw tightened. Inside, Karen pulled the curtain back again, watching him with the smugness of someone who thought she had acted nobly. She expected him to panic, to realize she had discovered his supposed contraband, and to feel grateful that she had intervened. Instead, what she saw unsettled her. He didn't look rattled. He looked focused, sharp, and calm, in a way that didn't match her assumptions. It was the calm of someone trained, someone prepared. By the time he finished securing the Jeep, his decision was made. He could not confront Karen recklessly. He knew escalation would only muddy the situation, but neither could he let her actions slide. What she had tampered with wasn't her business, wasn't the HOA's business, and wasn't even subject to ordinary community rules. It was federal business, and the consequences of interference were far more severe than an HOA fine. As dusk settled, Karen stepped onto her porch, arms crossed as though awaiting his acknowledgement. In her mind, she anticipated gratitude or perhaps an embarrassed explanation. She rehearsed what she would say if he dared challenge her. Something about neighborhood standards, safety, or unauthorized vehicles. Yet when their eyes met across the street, she felt something unexpected. A flicker of unease. His gaze wasn't one of a guilty neighbor. It was the steady stare of someone who knew far more than he let on. Later that evening, word began to ripple. Quietly through the neighborhood, a few children had seen Karen with the bolt cutters. A jogger had noticed her lingering by the Jeep. Whispers grew, weaving into conversations that stretched across driveways and under street lamps. Some defended her, saying she was only trying to protect the community. Others shook their heads, weary of her relentless interference. For years, Karen had pushed boundaries, but this time something felt different. The object of her scrutiny wasn't a lawn gnome, a paint color, or a mailbox flag. It was something heavier, something carrying, an air of danger. The Jeep's owner sat in his living room, a file open on his lap but unread. His mind replayed the image of the broken lock, the sheer audacity it took for a neighbor to cross that line. He wasn't angry in the ordinary sense. It was deeper, colder, a recognition that someone had jeopardized more than property. He considered his options. He could escalate it formally, report the incident to local authorities, and let Karen face charges she couldn't talk her way out of. Or he could handle it quietly, reminding her of boundaries in a way that would leave a lasting impression. Both paths carried weight, and both carried risks. Across the street, Karen wrote notes into a spiral-bound HOA logbook she kept for herself. She titled the entry, "Suspicious Jeep Incident," underlining it twice, convinced she had evidence to support her complaints. She felt powerful, righteous, and untouchable. In her world, the HOA shielded her from consequences as though community bylaws could override common law. She had no idea how mistaken she was. The night deepened, quiet except for the occasional bark of a distant dog. But beneath that calm exterior, Crestwood Meadows no longer felt like the same tidy, rule-governed place. A line had been crossed, and both sides knew it. Karen believed she had asserted control, but the Jeep's owner knew she had stumbled into something far bigger than herself. The question wasn't whether consequences would come, it was when and how severe they would be. For now, both houses sat across from each other in tense silence, divided by a street but destined for collision. The stage was set for the neighborhood drama to unfold, with the entire community unknowingly drawn into the fallout. This was only the beginning of the unraveling. The weekly HOA meeting at Crestwood Meadows was rarely exciting. Typically, it was an hour of monotone discussions about lawn maintenance schedules, parking policies, and reminders about trash pickup. But this week, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread quickly about Karen and the Jeep. Whispers about bolt cutters, a broken lock, and the mysterious contents of the vehicle had traveled from porch to porch, losing none of their intrigue along the way. By the time the residents gathered in the community clubhouse, the Jeep had become the centerpiece of neighborhood gossip. Karen arrived early, as she always did. Clutching her spiral-bound logbook like a weapon, she strutted into the room with her chin held high, radiating authority she didn't actually possess. She had spent the past few days polishing her version of events, framing herself not as a meddler, but as a vigilant guardian of the community. In her narrative, she had uncovered suspicious behavior and protected Crestwood Meadows from potential harm. She fully expected applause, or at the very least, nods of approval from her fellow residents. The room filled gradually, retired couples, young families, and the handful of board members who ran the association. People settled into folding chairs, murmuring quietly until the meeting began. The Jeep's owner, true to form, arrived silently and without fanfare. He slipped into a seat near the back, his expression unreadable. He wasn't one to attend HOA meetings regularly, but this time he needed to witness Karen's performance firsthand. He knew she would spin her story, and he intended to hear every word. The president of the HOA, a weary-looking man named Mr. Douglas, opened the meeting in his usual monotone. After covering routine matters about landscaping budgets and upcoming community events, Karen raised her hand with dramatic flair. Without waiting for permission, she stood, cleared her throat, and launched into her speech. She recounted her so-called discovery with theatrical detail. She described the Jeep as a mysterious, unauthorized vehicle that had raised alarms in her mind. She painted the locked compartment as evidence of something dangerous, implying criminal behavior without outright saying it. She bragged about her decisive action, presenting herself as the neighborhood's protector. She even waved her logbook around as if it were a piece of undeniable evidence. The room listened in silence, but it wasn't the silence of admiration. It was the silence of disbelief. Neighbors exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, others rolling their eyes. Everyone knew Karen's history. She had accused one family of running an illegal daycare because children played too loudly in their yard. She had filed complaints about the shade of blue someone painted their shutters. She once even demanded that a teenager remove his basketball hoop because it attracted the wrong element. To most, this Jeep incident was just another entry in her long list of exaggerated crusades. But this time, her theatrics carried heavier consequences. Her confession about cutting the lock left the room unsettled. It was one thing to issue complaints or send passive-aggressive letters. It was another to physically tamper with someone else's property. Several residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that her actions could expose the HOA itself to legal trouble. Karen, oblivious to the growing unease, continued her rant, convinced she was winning the room over. She imagined herself as a whistleblower, unveiling corruption and protecting her neighbors. She didn't notice the Jeep's owner watching her calmly from the back, his arms folded, his expression unmoving. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Her words were digging the hole deeper with every passing minute. When Karen finally finished, the silence was heavy. Mr. Douglas cleared his throat, clearly flustered. He mumbled something about needing to review the matter carefully, his eyes darting nervously toward the Jeep's owner. Karen, mistaking his discomfort for agreement, smirked proudly and sat down, certain she had made her case. Then came the moment Karen hadn't anticipated. The Jeep's owner stood slowly, his presence commanding the room in a way Karen never could. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he need to. With measured calm, he explained that the Jeep was not unauthorized, not suspicious, and certainly not illegal. He didn't go into detail, he couldn't, but he made it clear that it was official property tied to matters far beyond the scope of the HOA. He stated plainly that tampering with it was not only reckless, but unlawful. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The shift in the room was immediate. Neighbors who had been hesitant suddenly looked at Karen with alarm, realizing she had crossed a line far more serious than they'd understood. For the first time, Karen's confident smirk faltered. She stammered about only trying to help, but her words landed flat. The HOA president quickly moved to end the discussion, his nervousness palpable. He promised to look into the matter, but avoided eye contact with Karen. The meeting concluded awkwardly, with small groups forming in the corners of the room, whispering about what they had just heard. The story that Karen had hoped would elevate her instead became a cautionary tale spreading through Crestwood Meadows. As the residents left, Karen tried to intercept them, spinning her story again in quieter tones, insisting she had acted for the good of the community. But her words no longer carried the same weight. People nodded politely and moved on, unwilling to tie themselves to her reckless behavior. For the first time in years, her dominance in neighborhood affairs began to crack. The Jeep's owner slipped out quietly, offering no further explanation. His calm demeanor had been enough to plant unease in the minds of everyone present. He knew the situation was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. She thrived on conflict, and her pride would not let her accept that. She had been in the wrong, but now she was no longer armed with blind support. The tide of opinion in the neighborhood was shifting, and she stood increasingly isolated. That night, Crestwood Meadows buzzed with whispers. Some neighbors speculated that the Jeep belonged to law enforcement. Others guessed military or government work. The mystery deepened, and with it, Karen's position grew weaker. What had started as her attempt to assert control had instead set her apart as reckless and invasive. And though she didn't yet realize it, the true consequences of her actions had only just begun to unfold. For the Jeep's owner, the meeting confirmed what he already knew. Karen's meddling wouldn't stop on its own. She would double down, twist the story, and claw for relevance. But he also knew something Karen didn't. Her interference had already been noted beyond the neighborhood. Eyes outside of Crestwood Meadows were beginning to pay attention, and those eyes carried authority far greater than the HOA. The balance of power in the neighborhood was shifting, and the stage was being set for a reckoning Karen never anticipated. The days following the HOA meeting were unlike any others Crestwood Meadows had experienced. The usual calm of the neighborhood seemed fractured, replaced with quiet speculation and nervous glances. Conversations that once revolved around garden, care or school events now circled endlessly around the Jeep. The broken lock, the strange gear inside, the way its owner had spoken with a calm authority, none of it fit into the tidy suburban picture people had painted for themselves. Karen, however, refused to let the narrative slip from her grasp. She doubled down, visiting neighbors' porches with carefully rehearsed explanations, insisting that she had acted out of duty. In her telling, she had uncovered something dangerous, and her actions should have been celebrated, not questioned. But the more she spoke, the more resistance she encountered. Neighbors nodded politely but grew distant, unwilling to fuel her crusade. Where once she had thrived on their reluctant compliance, she now found herself talking to closed doors and cold stares. Meanwhile, the Jeep's owner was already working behind the scenes. He had filed the necessary report, not with the HOA, but with his task force. The tampering was documented, the chain of custody for the equipment reviewed, and protocols set in motion. To him, this wasn't just a personal grievance. It was a breach of security. His colleagues understood the weight of what had happened, and though the suburban backdrop seemed trivial compared to their usual operations, they treated it with the same seriousness. 2 days later, unmarked government vehicles rolled quietly into Crestwood Meadows. They didn't draw attention, at least not immediately. Men and women dressed in plain clothes moved with purpose, blending in enough not to alarm the entire neighborhood, but sharp-eyed residents noticed. They visited the Jeep's owner, spoke in low voices, and examined the vehicle with methodical precision. Some even canvassed the street subtly, asking if anyone had seen unusual activity near the Jeep. It didn't take long for Karen's name to surface. Several neighbors, hesitant but honest, mentioned seeing her with bolt cutters. Others admitted they'd overheard her boasting about her so-called intervention. The investigators took notes, their expressions giving nothing away, but the truth was undeniable. Karen had placed herself at the center of something far bigger than she could comprehend. By evening, Karen's confidence had begun to crack. She noticed the unfamiliar vehicles parked discreetly near the cul-de-sac, their occupants watching and waiting. She spotted one of them speaking to Mr. Douglas, the HOA president, who looked pale and uncomfortable as he nodded repeatedly. She saw neighbors glancing at her with a mix of pity and disapproval, their conversations halting when she walked by. The empire of control she had built, one complaint letter at a time, was collapsing under the weight of her own actions. But Karen was not one to admit defeat easily. In her mind, the presence of investigators only validated her suspicions. She convinced herself that the Jeep's owner had been caught, that the authorities were now involved because she had exposed something significant. She began crafting a new narrative, one where she was not the villain, but the whistleblower. She even scribbled drafts of statements she imagined giving to the press, rehearsing how she would present herself as the vigilant neighbor who dared to speak up. The investigators, however, saw right through her bravado. When they eventually knocked on her door, they were polite but firm. They asked her to recount what she had done. She eagerly obliged, describing her decision to cut the lock and search the compartment. Her tone was boastful at first, but as their questions grew sharper, her confidence wavered. When they asked why she thought she had the authority to damage someone else's property, her rehearsed lines faltered. When they pointed out that tampering with law enforcement equipment was a federal offense, her expression stiffened. Karen tried to defend herself, insisting she had acted for the good of the community. She claimed the Jeep was suspicious, that she had a duty to protect Crestwood Meadows. But the investigators were unmoved. They reminded her that the law didn't bend to personal feelings or neighborhood politics. She had crossed a line, one that carried real consequences. As the sun set that evening, the neighborhood buzzed with activity. The unmarked vehicles remained parked discreetly, their presence a constant reminder that something serious was unfolding. Neighbors whispered about Karen being questioned, about the possibility of charges, about what this meant for their once quiet community. Some felt sympathy, others satisfaction, but all of them knew the neighborhood had changed forever. The Jeep's owner watched it all unfold from his porch. He had no satisfaction in seeing Karen unravel. He wasn't motivated by revenge. But he understood the importance of accountability. In his world, actions had consequences, and Karen had been shielded from them for far too long. This wasn't about petty neighborhood disputes anymore. It was about respecting boundaries, about recognizing that self-appointed authority carried no weight against the real thing. Karen, alone in her house, paced restlessly. The bravado that had carried her for years was slipping away, replaced by an uneasy silence she couldn't ignore. The investigators had left her with no promises, only warnings. Her neighbors had withdrawn their support. Even the HOA board, once tolerant of her antics, now avoided her calls. For the first time, Karen felt the walls of her influence closing in. But even then, she refused to see herself as the problem. In her mind, she was still the misunderstood hero, punished for daring to speak the truth. She told herself the investigators were covering something up, that the Jeep's owner had powerful connections shielding him from accountability. She convinced herself that she was the victim, and that only she had the courage to expose what others were too afraid to see. Yet deep down, beneath the layers of denial, a sliver of fear had taken root. For years, Karen had thrived on pushing boundaries, confident that the worst she might face was a stern letter or a neighbor's scowl. Now she was facing something she couldn't manipulate or control. The reality of consequences, legal, undeniable, and irreversible, loomed larger than she ever expected. As night settled over Crestwood Meadows, the quiet hum of the neighborhood felt different. It was no longer the silence of ordinary suburban life, but the heavy quiet of a community waiting for the next shoe to drop. Karen clung to her justifications, rehearsing them in the dark, but even she couldn't ignore the truth pressing down on her. She had gone too far, and the cost of her actions was no longer hers alone to decide. The investigation had only just begun, and the storm it promised to unleash was far from over. The following week unfolded like a slow-motion unraveling of everything Karen had built her identity upon. For years, she had lived in Crestwood Meadows as if she were its self-appointed guardian. Her word carried weight at board meetings. Her complaints shaped HOA policy, and her intimidating presence kept neighbors in check. But now, the same neighbors who once tolerated her had begun to distance themselves. The air in the subdivision carried a different tension, one that seemed to hum with both curiosity and dread. The investigators had not disappeared. Their discreet presence lingered in the neighborhood. Sometimes it was a plain sedan parked near the clubhouse, its occupants blending in as though they were visitors. Other times it was a quiet figure walking the sidewalks, speaking briefly with residents under the guise of casual conversation. For Crestwood Meadows, it was unprecedented attention, and it unsettled everyone. What unsettled them most, however, was that Karen was at the center of it all. The HOA board, once Karen's reluctant audience, began to see her as a liability. They held an emergency meeting without her knowledge, debating the implications of her actions. Mr. Douglas, the weary president, argued that the association could not afford to be dragged into legal disputes because of one member's recklessness. Others agreed, pointing out that Karen's behavior had escalated beyond letters and lectures. It was now potentially criminal. By the end of the meeting, they drafted a motion to formally censure her, stripping her of any unofficial influence she held. It was a symbolic step, but one that carried weight in the eyes of the community. When Karen found out, she was livid. She stormed into Douglas's driveway the next morning, waving her logbook in his face and accusing him of betrayal. Her voice carried across the street, sharp and shrill, waking early risers and drawing curtains back from windows. Douglas, tired of years of intimidation, stood his ground. He told her plainly that the HOA was not her weapon, and her actions were hers alone to answer for. For the first time in their long and antagonistic relationship, Karen found herself without the last word. She sputtered insults, but Douglas simply turned and walked inside, leaving her fuming on the pavement. The neighborhood watched, silently, taking note. The spectacle that once made Karen appear powerful now made her look desperate. Parents whispered to their children to stay away from her house. Neighbors who once humored her avoided eye contact. The fortress of influence she had crafted was crumbling brick by brick. Meanwhile, the Jeep's owner carried himself with the same calm discretion he always had. He didn't speak much to his neighbors, but his quiet composure only deepened the mystery. People whispered that he was law enforcement, that the Jeep was tied to something official and serious. The more Karen tried to spin her narrative, the less credibility she carried. The neighborhood, once her stage, had turned against her. Then came the knock at her door. It was late afternoon when two investigators returned, this time not for questions, but to deliver a formal notice. Karen opened the door with forced politeness, still trying to frame herself as cooperative, but her expression shifted when she was handed the document. It outlined the seriousness of her actions: tampering with federal property, unlawful entry into a secured vehicle, and interference with official equipment. The language was clear, the potential consequences severe. Her confidence cracked. For all her bluster, Karen had never truly believed her actions could lead to charges. She had lived in a world where the worst outcome was a fine or a neighbor's complaint. The idea of federal charges was foreign, terrifying. She argued, pleaded, and attempted to reframe herself as a victim of misunderstanding. But the investigators remained unmoved. They explained the process, the next steps, and the possibility that this would not remain confined to Crestwood Meadows. When they left, Karen sat at her dining table, the notice trembling in her hands. For the first time in years, her house felt oppressively quiet. The curtains she once used as her watchtower now hung heavy, offering no comfort. She replayed the moment of cutting the lock, the snap of metal, the thrill of victory. It no longer felt like triumph. It felt like the instant everything began to collapse. The neighborhood noticed the change in her. She no longer strutted down sidewalks or cornered residents with her lectures. Instead, she moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, her shoulders tense under the weight of scrutiny. But whispers followed her everywhere. Parents warned their children not to be near when she walked by. Neighbors shared updates about the investigation in hushed voices. She had become the cautionary tale she once delighted in pointing out in others. For the Jeep's owner, this was the inevitable reckoning. He hadn't asked for it, hadn't wanted the attention, but he recognized its necessity. Karen had crossed lines repeatedly, unchecked and unchallenged. Now she was facing a boundary she couldn't manipulate, one enforced by law rather than neighborhood politics. The board called another meeting, this time with nearly the entire neighborhood in attendance. The tension was palpable as Douglas addressed the residents. He explained that while the HOA couldn't interfere with legal matters, they could protect the community from further disruption. With little resistance, the board voted to bar Karen from participating in any official HOA business. It was the final blow to her self-made position of authority. Karen attended the meeting but left halfway through, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She muttered about conspiracies, about cover-ups, about being silenced, but her words fell flat in the crowded room. For once, no one listened. The empire she had built on fear and interference had fallen, and she stood alone among the ruins. That night, Crestwood Meadows felt lighter. Conversations at mailboxes carried laughter again. Children played outside without sharp interruptions. Even the air seemed freer, as though a long-held tension had been released. But beneath the relief, an undercurrent of unease remained. They all knew the situation wasn't finished. The investigators were still involved, and Karen's fate hung in the balance. In her house, Karen sat by the window, watching the Jeep across the street. Its lock had been replaced, its compartments secured tighter than before. To her, it was no longer just a vehicle. It was the symbol of her downfall, the reminder of a single decision that had spiraled beyond her control. Yet even as fear gnawed at her, pride whispered in her ear. She told herself she was still right, still the only one brave enough to see what others ignored. But the truth was undeniable. Crestwood Meadows had turned against her. The law had taken notice, and the reckoning she had long evaded was finally at her door. The storm Karen had summoned upon herself unfolded with relentless precision, each wave of consequence heavier than the last, until the entire community was watching her downfall like a slow-motion train wreck that couldn't be stopped. It was No longer a matter of one homeowner versus the HOA, this was a case that had spilled into the larger narrative of how entitlement, arrogance, and unchecked behavior could topple even the most stubborn figures. Karen had thought she could hide behind the shield of the HOA, that her position gave her untouchable authority, but authority abused always came crashing down under the weight of its own corruption, and that crash was swift, loud, and permanent. The task force's case against her and the HOA board members was airtight. Surveillance footage showed her cutting the lock on the Jeep. Witness testimony proved she boasted about it afterward. Emails and texts revealed her efforts to rally board members to teach that troublemaker a lesson. By the time federal investigators presented their findings, Karen was not simply an overbearing neighbor anymore. She was a suspect in criminal tampering, interference with a police operation, and malicious intent. The image of her being escorted out of her immaculate house in handcuffs spread like wildfire, a viral spectacle the internet could not resist. What she once considered her empire had turned into a stage where her own downfall was the main act. But beyond the headlines and the schadenfreude, there were real shifts happening within the community. The HOA that once operated unchecked was suddenly fractured, scrambling for legitimacy. Members who had blindly followed Karen's lead were forced to face their complicity. Meetings that used to be staged displays of control now became hotbeds of accountability, residents demanding to know how so much power had been placed in the hands of one woman. Some resigned on the spot, others tried to distance themselves, but the shadow of Karen's actions tainted them all. For the first time, the HOA faced the possibility of being dissolved entirely. What was once seen as an untouchable institution had been cracked open, its flaws laid bare for everyone to see. As for me, the ordeal left scars but also revelations. At first it felt surreal, like living inside a story too wild to be true. Watching Karen's arrogance build, peak, and collapse had been exhausting, but in the end, there was a certain grim satisfaction in knowing the truth had prevailed. My Jeep, once the symbol of her petty vendetta, was now a symbol of resilience. It was repaired, polished, and parked proudly in my driveway, no longer under siege, but instead under the silent guard of a community that had been forced to open its eyes. Every time I walked past it, I felt the weight of what it represented, the fight to stand firm against intimidation, and the proof that even the most ordinary person could topple the loudest bully when backed by truth. Karen, meanwhile, became the cautionary tale. Her name carried no respect, only ridicule. News outlets dissected her story, neighbors whispered about her with disdain, and her once pristine reputation had been permanently stained. Even those who had once feared her now laughed at her downfall, though behind those laughs lingered the uncomfortable awareness of how long they had allowed her to reign unchecked. She wasn't just Karen anymore. She was a symbol of everything that could go wrong when arrogance meets power. And that symbol lived on in every meme, every article, and every retelling of the saga. But perhaps the greatest irony was this. Karen had always sought control, the feeling of being above others. In the end, she lost everything because she couldn't see past her own ego. She thought she was invincible, but her downfall proved just how fragile her power truly was. Once the veneer cracked, there was nothing beneath but insecurity and spite. And now, stripped of her title, her influence, and her control, she was just another disgraced figure left to live in the shadow of her own actions. Life in the neighborhood eventually found a new rhythm. Without Karen looming over every decision, there was room for growth, for fairness, for actual community. New leadership rose, built not on intimidation but on cooperation. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began speaking up, realizing that silence had been part of what gave Karen her power. The atmosphere shifted from one of fear to one of cautious hope, as though everyone collectively understood they had survived a storm and could now rebuild. And though the memory of Karen lingered, it served less as a wound and more as a reminder of what they would never allow again. For me, it was not about vengeance, but closure. Watching Karen fall was never the goal. It was about standing my ground, refusing to be intimidated. And while her collapse became the spectacle, what mattered more was the freedom that came after. No more threats about petty violations. No more sabotage masked as enforcement. No more shadow wars fought with gossip and fines. Instead, there was peace. And within that peace, the quiet satisfaction that justice, real, undeniable justice, had been served. And so the story of the HOA Karen who cut my lock and tried to snatch my Jeep came to its end, not with her victory, but with her exposure. She hadn't known it belonged to a police task force, and that ignorance had set her downfall in motion. It was a story too strange for fiction, a lesson written in real life, and one that carried a weight far beyond just one Jeep or one neighbor. It was about arrogance undone, about resilience rewarded, and about the unshakable truth that power, without humility, always destroys itself. Karen's reign ended not with applause, but with silence. A silence that echoed louder than her shouts ever had. A silence that marked the close of one chapter and the opening of another. And in that silence, I knew once and for all that the struggle had been worth it.